Welcome to this EUMENIA policy lecture on the EU and democracy promotion in the Middle East. I'm Daniela Huber. I'm head of the Middle East and Mediterranean department at the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome. Now, before starting this lecture, I should maybe say that I will focus today very much on the view from the European Union, while there is a sister lecture to this one, which focuses on the view from the Middle East. Now, let me briefly open my slides. So this lecture today will be in three parts. We will start with some conceptual and theoretical reflections, which will help us to analyze EU democracy promotion in the Middle East. And on the basis of this, we will close with some questions and an assignment. Now, when thinking about democracy promotion, we of course need to engage first central concepts. Most importantly, obviously, democracy, which is an essentially contested concept across the whole globe. In Western education, we often grow up with this narrative which situates democracy in Europe along a timeline which is drawn from ancient Athens through the Italian Renaissance to the Magna Carta and the French and American revolutions. Now, this ignores two things. Firstly, it ignores the diverse democratic thought which has grown in many parts of the world. And if we acknowledge that, then we actually need to problematize the conception of democracy promotion we have. Is democracy promotion the export or imposition of one's own model on another society? Or is it rather the engagement with another society on how we can learn from each other what democracy actually means? And this latter kind of conceptions has, for example, been used by Labi Sadiki and Laila Saleh in their concept of a democratic didactic loop. However, most of the literature on democracy promotion actually employs the first kind of conception of democracy promotion. Now, secondly, what is also often ignored when thinking about democracy in the West is that it has developed over time in a particular relationship to colonialism and slavery. Achille Mbembe has highlighted this, for example, when reflecting on the dark side of democracy. While I cannot go into detail here, I think we can shortly reflect on how particular definitions of democracy silences such questions or not. If you have, for example, a procedural definition of democracy, then you can claim to have a functioning democracy with competitive elections, despite, for example, structural racist policies or colonial practices abroad. Now, if you have a more comprehensive definition of democracy, this silencing is not possible because human rights become a condition for democracy, both within a state, but also in a state's foreign relations. Now, to turn to thinking about types of democracy promotion, there is the paradigmatic typology of Frank Schimmelpfennig and Sandra Lavanek's on linkage, leverage, and governance. Now, linkage is very much a bottom-up approach. So this is support for civil society organizations, for example, human rights groups, or also transnational exchanges, as, for example, Erasmus does. Leverage, in contrast, is top-down. So this is the relationship to another government. And so what is usually used here is this concept of positive and negative political conditionality. So positive would mean that the EU rewards partner governments for reforms, and negative would mean that it sanctions governments, for example, if they employ massive human rights violations. Now, governance is different. This is about sectoral cooperation arrangements between the EU and public administrations in third countries. And what I would like to mention here is that this can also be framed a bit differently. So, and I would like to mention the work of Beste Islein here on neoliberal governmentality in EU programs, which, as she argues, make local conditions serviceable to neoliberal governing patterns. Now, all these three types, linkage, leverage, and governance, are usually thought of in a one-way road, so the EU exporting its own model of democracy, but we could also start to think about them in a more equal and shared way as a mutual engagement, and I will come back to this in the assignment in the end of this lecture. Now to turn to some theoretical reflections to answer the question, why democracy promotion? Because we focus on the European Union, so why does the European Union promote democracy? The four big IR theories have all reflected on this. Classical and structural realists such as Wald and Waltz see democracy promotion as a dangerous crusade. Adrian Hyde-Price has argued that democracy promotion is a second-order concern, and it surfaces only if first-order concerns such as security and economic interests are not at stake. Now, in light of the democratic peace paradigm, so this conviction that democracies do not wage war against each other, democracy promotion was increasingly also framed as a security policy, particularly by some neoclassical motivational realists. This has not been so far from where neoconservatives came in, who pushed for democracy promotion as a policy for peace, which then turned out to be a policy for war in the case of the US-led invasion into Iraq in 2003. Now, to turn to liberalism and to open up the black box of the state, there are domestic actors who might push a government into a democracy or human rights promotion. So this could be civil society organizations, but also companies with commercial interests. I would particularly like to mention here the work of the boomerang model of Ressesi, King and Kopp, which focuses on how civil society organizations can also cooperate transnationally to put a government under pressure. Now, to turn to constructivism, democracy promotion is rooted in a democratic identities and human rights norms pull on democracies to pursue such a foreign policy. Ian Manners, for example, has argued that the EU's normative base predisposes it to act in a normative way in world politics. Now, promoting democracy abroad also constructs an image of the self as democratic and continuously projects this image on the self, the other, and the broader international community. And this is already where critical theory comes in, because democracy promotion manipulates how other states perceive the international system and the roles of democracies within it. So thinking into that direction could be informed by the work of Robert Cox. Furthermore, I would like to mention the work of Raffaele De Sarto here, who has argued that democracy promotion could be linked to a civilizing missions of a normative empire, Europe. Now, going more to the level of foreign policy analysis, then democracy promotion as a practice also falls into a particular politics of representation, whereby Western democracies portray themselves as democratic models. And there's, for example, the work of Roxane Doughty in this respect. Now, this does two things. Internally, it brushes over democracy's own shortcomings, which have been recently exposed, for example, in the Black Lives Matter protests. And externally, it draws a clear border to the global south. So David Campbell, for example, has worked on this. And so the global south is portrayed as not being there yet, as lagging behind, or as a bad remaking or hybrid of the Western example. And again, Bahar Rumelili, for example, has worked on this, on the particular case of EU-Turkey relations. Now, to use these theoretical reflections, we will now turn to the analysis of EU democracy promotion. Now, initially, when the European community was founded, democracy has actually not been an established value of the European integration project. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 did not mention democracy or human rights at all. It became a core criterion for membership in the 1970s when Spain applied to membership in the European community. And at about the same time, the European community started to think about a shared foreign policy. And so democracy entered this discourse as well as a means to create such a shared foreign policy identity. Now, after the end of the Cold War with the Maastricht Treaty, the promotion of democracy becomes a key objective objective in the EU common foreign and security policy. And we see that discourse actually intensifies in the early 1990s. In 1995, for example, the Commission stated that in an international environment in which the universal nature of human rights is increasingly emphasized, the European Union has gradually come to define itself in terms of the promotion of those rights and democratic freedoms. So in terms of practices, we see that in the early 1990s, EU agreements all include a clause that makes the respect for human rights and democratic principles an essential element. So if a partner government engages in massive human rights violations, the EU could trigger this clause, and as a result, the association agreement would come to a halt. Regarding the Mediterranean region specifically, all association agreements in the framework of the Barcelona process include this essential element clause, but it has never been triggered. Since 1995, the European Union also set up the civil society instrument, the European Instrument for Democracy and Human Rights. So when we look at this period, constructivist explanations I mentioned before, so the need for a shared identity first and foremost for the new European Union shed a light on this development. Now, this changes after 9/11 in this war on terror period. Increasingly, democracy promotion becomes a means that would delimit the EU from the other, specifically from its other in the south. So it becomes an example of the inscription of boundaries which demarcate the inside from the outside and the self from the other. Increasingly, the EU is depicted as an enlightened democratic area of peace, and the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean as a backward area of autocracy, terrorism, and instability that needed to be solved through EU intervention. Very indicative are, for example, the Laeken Council conclusions in this respect, which I have copied in here and will briefly read to you. Following the fall of the Berlin Wall, it looked briefly as though we would for a long while be living in a stable world order free from conflict, founded upon human rights. Just a few years later, however, there is no such certainty. The 11th of September has brought a rude awakening. The opposing forces have not gone away. Religious fanaticism, ethnic nationalism, racism, and terrorism are on the increase, and regional conflicts, poverty, and underdevelopment still provide a constant seedbed for them. What is Europe's role in this changed world? Does Europe not, now that it is finally unified, have a leading role to play in a new world order? That of a power able to play a stabilizing role worldwide and to point the way ahead for many countries and peoples? Europe, as the continent of human values, the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the French Revolution, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. The continent of liberty, solidarity, and above all diversity, meaning respect for others' languages, cultures, and traditions. The European Union's one boundary is democracy and human rights. So this boundary making is very clear here, and that the other is fanaticist, nationalist, racist, and terrorist, whereas on the side of the EU, very positive adjectives are mentioned, and also only the positive events in European history rather than the negative events. What also happens in this period is that the EU refers to each other, to itself increasingly as a civilian power. And it's interesting because at the same time, literature on normative power Europe evolves in Europe. And as Muneva Cebeci, for example, has argued, this has reproduced the EU's own ideal power Europe narrative. Now, in terms of practices, in the early 2000s, the EU sets up the European Neighborhood Policy, which seeks to establish a ring of friends around the EU through a benchmarking approach, according to which democratization and economic liberalization, as well as cooperation with the EU regarding issues such as migration or security, should be rewarded. It should be maybe mentioned here that this happened in the wake of what was then perceived as the enormous success of the Eastern enlargement of the European Union. When Eastern Europe, in the language of the European Union, became European. And this idea of becoming European was then also applied to the neighborhood, but without the actual option of becoming European, of joining the European Union. So with these geographies of candidate countries and neighborhood countries, a very particular geography of concentric circles was set up by the European Union. The EU's definition of democracy in this policy was essentially a liberal market democracy. In terms of instruments for promoting human rights, they were seen as rather technocratic, whereby the EU was not sensitive to more locally grown and supported models, which might put more emphasis on issues such as social justice or religion. So what literature has found here is the EU practice local needs gap. And furthermore, the literature has also pointed to another important gap, which Federica Bicchi, for example, has called the discourse practice gap. That is that the EU would state that it promotes democracy and human rights, but when it comes to confront autocrats or to accept the democratic elections of Hamas in the Palestinian parliamentary election, the EU actually backtracked. As Michel Patch has pointed out, this resulted in a complete loss of credibility of the European Union in the Middle East. Now, what happened after 2011 with the Arab uprisings is that initially the EU admits mistakes. So Commissioner Füle argued that too many of us fell prey to the assumption that authoritarian regimes were a guarantee of stability in the region. This was not even realpolitik. It was at best short-termism, and the kind of short-termism that makes the long-term ever more difficult to build. So initially, the EU also reacts with new instruments, civil society instruments mainly. But we still see that the practices of before do continue, which is maybe most clear in the example of the 2013 coup in Egypt and the following Raba massacre, after which the European Union discussed to put the association agreement on hold, but eventually it decided against this. Furthermore, what happened since the Arab uprisings is that the EU has to begin to prioritize issues of migration and de-radicalization in the neighborhood over issues of democracy and human rights. Indeed, what we observe today, almost 10 years into the Arab uprising, is what is called the EU's pragmatic turn. So we are still, of course, in the middle of this, but we can already see some patterns here, because for the EU today, the important project is not focused on the neighborhoods. The important projects are the Green Deal and the Defense Union, which are entirely focused on the European Union itself. When it comes to relations with societies in third states, the concept of resilience has been introduced into EU language. It remains a bit unclear, but tendentially its approach remains rooted in the neoliberal market paradigm. There are, of course, different concepts or approaches to resilience. So on the one hand, it can be seen as an adaptation to a particular reality, even to an oppressive reality, but it can also be seen as a form of resistance against such a reality through endurance, for example. So much will depend on how this is eventually defined. To turn to some questions and an assignment. Firstly, I think it's interesting to discuss what explains the EU's pragmatic turn. One can, on the one hand, look into the European Union and shifting politics in the European Union itself. And one can also look more towards a changing world in which the European Union is maybe increasingly provincialized. The second question is, how cohesive is EU foreign policy in the field of democracy promotion? A recurring issue has been that member states undermine EU policy. An example is the arms deals that have increased, particularly between France and Egypt after the coup in 2013. The third question you could discuss is, how credible is the EU as a democracy or resilience promoter? So the issue of double standards is a recurring theme too. The EU and its member states have their own democratic deficits. And when it comes for resilience, it is very obvious with the rise of ethnocentric right-wing populism that issues of racism persist in European societies. Now, to turn to an assignment, What has become clear in this lecture, I think, is that the European Union has usually looked at democracy promotion as a one-way road, exporting its own model towards the Middle East. And now, many of my interviewees in the Middle East said that was a neo-colonial policy, and so I would like you to reflect about the question how a or anti-colonial approach to democracy and human rights support could look like in practice. Finally, I have mentioned a few academics in my lecture, and they are all listed here. This is not a comprehensive overview of the literature on the EU and democracy promotion in the Middle East, but it gives you a first inroad into this literature. With this, I would like to thank you for your attention. I hope this has been helpful, and I really encourage you to also look at the other lectures in this EUMENIA policy lecture series.